What's going on, everybody? I'm Jason Schroeder, Tech Editor at e-mtb, and today I'm going to run you through my 2025 Stumpjumper 15 Alloy, which has been my test bike for this year. I've been riding this bike for about 7 months now. I've been really enjoying it, so I figured I'd run you through what it's been like to live with this bike and the parts I'm currently running and testing on it. Starting from the top, I am 6 feet tall and I'm riding an S4 Stumpjumper. I have it set up with dual 29-inch wheels. I have a 160mm travel fork up front to help counter the taller fork. I have it set up in the steep headset flip cup position. And then out back, I have the horse pivot flip chip set to the low long chainstay position. The spark notes on how I have this bike set up, I would say, is that it's definitely geared more towards descending and being stable. I raced downhill for a lot of years. That's definitely what I focus on when I go out and ride. So it's heavy without being too laborious to get back uphill, still has decent maneuverability, and I think overall this generation of Stumpjumper does spread its abilities pretty even. I would say it's maybe 60% descending focused, 40% climbing focused. Other things worth noting about the geometry, this bike does have a pretty tall stack, which I really like and prefer. Really puts you tall and low in the bike. The chainstay length is pretty short. I want to say it's a 335 as the bike comes, put in the low BB position, which makes the chainstay longer. You're looking at around 441 millimeters. On a size largish bike, that's definitely short. I wouldn't say it's to a degree that takes away from the abilities of the bike. I did notice riding it in that high position when the chainstay is shortest that there's instances where my weight was too far back. Started to have some times where my front wheel would start to run wide in corners. Going to the longer position, not a huge change, honestly not a huge difference. I noticed the bottom bracket being lower a lot more, helped this bike settle into turns better, just getting your weight a little bit lower within the bike itself. Last thing geo-wise worth mentioning is the seat angle is pretty slack by today's standards. To help counter that slack seat angle, I have my seat slid all the way forward on the rails, which has definitely brought that effective seat angle more forward. It's made the bike a lot more enjoyable to climb. Moving on to frame details, I'll start with things I've liked about living with the Stumpjumper. Nothing comes loose. I haven't had any bolts back out, no plays developed. I'm never having to check bolts on this bike, which is really nice. It makes it easy to live with, hop on, go ride. I have ridden this in quite a bit of mixed conditions, whether it's mud this week in Whistler. I got quite a bit of mud when I was in Finale earlier this year, and then a bunch of dry, sandy conditions back home in San Diego. And I pulled the bike apart twice now to check bearings. All the bearings are running fine. I don't think I mentioned it, but I'm around 600 miles in on this bike, so enough time that you'd probably start to see an issue if there was one. Another detail I really like is the internal cable routing on this bike is guided, and it's super easy to run, whether it's the shifting or your rear brake line. My partner actually has a carbon version of this bike, and the routing on that, especially on the bottom bracket, is actually quite a bit more difficult to get the cables to dive into the housing inside the frame. The paint has been super solid. Haven't had any chipping, not really any scuffs or anything too crazy like that. And then the internal storage on this bike is one of the more usable doors and openings I've found on bikes. So this actually uses the previous generation door and latch, but the opening is really wide. So I've been running pretty much for 6 months now, a tube, a pouch from a Pivot Firebird. Shout Pivot, they make really good pouches. I may or may not have accidentally kept that thing after I tested your bike, but it has some zippers in it that I can get a multi-tool, tire levers, and an air tag. And then with that in there, I still have room to stuff like a windbreaker when I'm on a ride. It's definitely a feature now that I don't think I could live without. It's just really handy. I hate wearing a pack, so having functional frame storage is really nice. Moving on to quirks and other things that haven't been maybe the best about owning this bike. The main thing has been it creaks. So I originally thought the headset was creaking, ended up pinpointing that it was my actual seat tube and the dropper interface. Started by greasing it, that didn't help. Went to running it dry, that didn't help. Ended up settling on carbon paste, which has resolved the noise and issue. It's kind of counterintuitive because this is an alloy frame. And then it turns out the headset is creaky. So I've had to resort to pulling it apart probably once a month to clean it and re-grease it. It's not actually the headset bearings, but it's the cups and how they fit in the frame. That concentric design, I think, is just prone to creaking. Unfortunately, it doesn't make it a whole month before it starts creaking again. I just get lazy and don't want to be pulling it apart. Okay, so after I filmed this video, I was looking at the upper cup of my headset more closely and realized that the upper cup wasn't sitting flush on the frame. I ended up swapping to the slack position, so flipping the cup 180 degrees, and after a few rides, the creak came back and the cup was no longer sitting flush again. I've now gone back to the neutral headset cup, and so far, the cup has remained flush, hasn't creaked after a few rides, so the angle adjust binding in the frame seems to have been the culprit. Hopefully, it remains quiet. The last thing I'm going to try if a noise does come back is using carbon paste between the cup and the frame like I did with the seat post. And then the last small detail, which isn't the biggest deal, but something that's kind of annoying, is where the rear brake comes out of the front triangle and goes into the rear chainstay. It's held by a clip, doesn't make any noise, but it goes right over the bolt head of that lower pivot. So it's super hard to get an Allen in there. Check to make sure it's tight. It hasn't come loose, but you know, every now and again I have to check bolts on my bike, and I end up having to pull that out to get Allen in there, which is a little annoying. Moving along, let's get into what parts I have hung on this bike right now. So Specialized does sell the Stumpjumper alloy as a frame only with a shock, and that is where I started. Up front, I have a RockShox Lyrik Ultimate fork. Again, 160 millimeters of travel. I've really enjoyed this fork. It's got awesome off-the-top suppleness, great ground feel and control. It's also got really nice compliance. It's not like a noodle, but it's not too stiff. It's pretty light in hand. It's a decently light fork. I think they listed it around 2,100 grams. And probably most importantly is it's been super consistent. So I've been riding this fork for months in a bunch of different types of conditions, and it just feels the same every time I get on it, which again, just like the bike itself, if I can go out and ride, not to think about my setup, I'm gonna be stoked. Last thing too is the damper is very usable. It's easy to set up. I love what RockShox is doing with starting the middle, going plus or minus for clicks. I feel like it's just easier to understand. Out back, I currently have a Fox Genie Float X shock, which I did just throw on. I've only done a few rides with. Honestly, have not noticed a massive difference compared to the Float Genie shock that comes on this bike. Probably the biggest difference is the fact that this has an external low speed adjustment, and being able to crank that in does give the bike a bit more platform for the few times that I've wanted that out of it. I definitely want to touch on the Float Genie shock, as that's the shock I rode for the first 6 months on this bike. And it was really impressive. I mean, for how simple it looks, just being an inline shock, you don't get too many external adjustments. It can handle a lot of really aggressive riding. I think that shock, and honestly this shock too, just paired with this bike, makes it feel like it has more travel than it does, which, like, I know is super cliche, but the way that shock handles bumps and gives you really good ground feel, it's really plush and supple, but matches that with really good bottom out support, makes it where you can ride the bike really hard. You know, I would say that if you've ridden a Stumpjumper in years past, you might get on this and think it's maybe lacking a little bit of support, which I would say is true. I think you can get that level of support if you stuff the shock full of volume reducers. I would urge anybody who rides this bike to run it stock, which is one volume reducer, or take that out, because what you can get away with on this bike set up with, you know, it kind of basically being like the most linear, is wild. Like just the way you can charge into things and yeah, have really good ground feel, good traction, consistency. The bike doesn't pitch too bad. Like, you just stay centered in it and you can put your weight into the bike, and even though it feels maybe a little bit soft or, you know, maybe a little too plush, you get that ending stroke support, which is really cool. It's really fascinating. And yeah, for how tiny that shock looks, don't doubt it, you know, like, give it a chance. I think it can impress a lot of people. All right, drivetrain. Currently have SRAM's new Transmission 90, which is their mechanical version of transmission. I've only got maybe a month on this drivetrain, and initial takeaways so far is it feels the same as electronic wireless transmission if you've ridden that. So you're gonna be in store for the same crisp, tight shifting performance, which I'm a pretty big fan of. The derailleur clutch is super tight. This thing does not make any noise. I'm hopeful that that'll stay the same way as I get more months into testing. The shifter feels kind of cheaper, a little flimsy if I'm being honest, but it works, it gets the job done. Setup on it is maybe a little bit interesting. It follows a different path than, you know, a traditional mechanical drivetrain where you have limits and a B tension. we have a video on our YouTube kind of going into it a lot if you want to watch it. But what I've noticed is it is fairly touchy to tension on the cable. So it requires a decent amount of tension from what I've found, but if you go past that, it's not gonna work. So you need the tension to get the chain up the cassette. If you go too much, it makes it hard for the chain to go down the cassette. So it's probably the only thing with that. It's heavy, which my bike's already heavy. Heavy drivetrain, not the biggest deal. I do like the fact that you get the bash guards on the front chainring. I think that is a nice touch. Yeah, we'll report back in, you know, another 6 months, because in my mind, this is like the working rider's drivetrain. So it needs to last for a whole year to, you know, really be worth it in my mind. For brakes, I'm running Shimano's new XT 4-piston brakes. I rode Shimano's XTR brakes and their XTR new Di2 wireless drivetrain for, again, the first 6 months I had this bike. So if you want to learn more about all of that, I'll put a link for the video right here. These brakes compared to XTR, they feel the same to me. If I'm being honest, I don't know if I'd splurge on XTR. Really, the only difference to these is they have a 2-piece caliper. Haven't noticed a performance difference, if I'm being honest. And then the lever blade itself on these is different than XTR, but if you never have the chance to ride both, you won't notice a difference either. So the feel of these brakes feels pretty much the same to me when it comes to power and modulation. You get good power feed, good modulation. You can really roll on that power. These lack the power and bite that you can find with other brakes right now. I would say that's the one downside with these brakes to me. If you've ridden Mavens, Hayes, TRPs, really any brakes like that, these just aren't gonna have as much power. That's just the brutal truth. I am running 203 Magura rotors that are thicker than Shimano's rotors, and then I'm running it with metallic pads to try to increase that bite, that initial power coming on stronger, which has helped a little bit. Moving along, I have a OneUp Cockpit. I have their alloy handlebar cut down to 780 with a 30 mil rise, and then I have a 50 mil stem. I've never had a carbon bar break on me, but the thought of it freaks me out, so I'm very pro alloy handlebars. Moving on to the dropper post, I have RockShox new Axis Reverb post in a 200 millimeter length. That thing has been fine so far, no issues. It's simple, it's clean, you don't have extra levers. Before this, I had a OneUp dropper that was simple, it worked, it was easy. It was also $300 less, so this was free. If I'm being honest, I probably would stay with the OneUp if it was my own money. It is nice having less cables on your cockpit, but I think I'd rather have 300 bucks in my pocket. And then the new remote, I'm not a big fan of. I think it's bulky, kind of ugly. It's not as ergonomic as the previous Axis dropper lever. Don't think I mentioned it, but I got Deity's T-Mac pedals for pedals, probably some of the best flat pedals out there. And then for wheels and tires, I have E13 Sylvan Carbon Trail Enduro wheels, and then I have specialized Cannibal downhill casing tires mounted to those. The wheels, I'm honestly really only running because I wanted to spend more time on E13 Sidekick Hub, which has been interesting because the first time I rode it, I was pretty fond of it. I thought it, you know, really helped the suspension be a bit more active. It rolls super fast, and I would say the ladder has been the only thing that's really held true having ridden it again. It rolls fast, but it's been hard for me to really pull out if there's a performance benefit and, you know, less kickback, the bike being able to work better with that extra float in the hub. While I'm here in Whistler, my plan is to do some back-to-back testing with the regular hub, and then I've got some other kickback devices I can't talk about yet that's why I'm riding this, is to compare against that. So time will tell, we'll come back to it at some point. The tires I've been running for about a month and a half now, and this was just out of curiosity. I've ridden these a little bit in the past, but never really put them to the test on proper trails. I would say they're a really good mixed terrain tire, comparable to like a Continental Cryptotol, Maxxis High Roller, WTB Vigilante, like those tires where you can kind of take them anywhere and they perform pretty sweet. These tires are also quite a bit cheaper than other tires out there right now. I want to say these will run you about $90 US. We'll see how they last. That's kind of always the key with tires. I think a lot of riders out there, especially with the rear tire, would almost rather save money, get a tire that'll last a couple months versus, you know, blowing through some super tacky rubber really quick. But yeah, thus far, initial impressions of this tire is definitely climbing the ranks for something that I would take and ride kind of across the board. And then last two things, I've got a WTB Silverado saddle, classic saddle, fits my butt nicely. And then I have some 4-year-old Truvative grips that I got at a press camp that have a good squish to them. I'm almost positive they don't make them anymore, so if the day comes I gotta upgrade my grips, it's gonna be a bit of a bummer. Yeah, I think that's it for the parts I currently have hung on this right now. It's kind of always changing, it's always evolving. I'm sure in a month my bike will look quite a bit different. It's a good problem to have. I am definitely not complaining. But if you see me out on the trails, it probably won't look like this. The last thing I want to touch on about my Stumpjumper 15 alloy is it's freaking heavy. Okay, this thing is a tank. I don't know the exact weight yet. I'll put it on the screen right now. I know it's over 40 pounds. Here's the cons of that. It's really tiring to pedal. It's slow moving. I burn way more calories climbing on this bike than probably any other trail bike I've owned. It's not the most maneuverable. It's definitely less maneuverable than if I had gone with the carbon version of this bike. And then it takes more effort to get this bike up to speed and carry speed on flatter terrain. Then the pros of riding such a heavy bike is this thing is really glued to the ground. It's super stable. It's not easily phased or knocked offline. It allows me to ride with a much higher intensity and charge into things than if I was on a traditional lighter trail bike. I would say the weight and where it is on this bike makes for a really interesting ride quality, where the fork is pretty light. So when you're riding, it's pretty light in your hands. It's easy to steer, get the front wheel off the ground, move it around. But then a lot of that weight is maybe not necessarily super low, but it's kind of centered with my body when I ride. So yeah, it makes it to where I'm not getting jostled around. I'm not getting, shifted front or back or side to side over the bike. But if I do want to kind of, pick and choose where I want to go, it doesn't feel like I'm necessarily steering the biggest ship. So it's a unique feeling. I feel like I've been preaching weight to everybody the last few months riding this bike. And yeah, at some point I'm going to want a lighter, probably a shorter travel bike if I'm being honest. But for the time being, this is definitely making me stronger on climbs. That is for sure. All right, that's all I got for now. That concludes my mid-year check-in of my Alloy Stumpjumper 15. Please let me know if you have any questions about my setup, the way I'm running the bike, or any of the parts that I've tested. And as always, you can head to vitalmtb.com for more mountain bike news and reviews. Cheers. I'm getting eaten up by bugs right now.